My name is Olivia Nicastro, and the topic I researched was climate change. I looked at this topic through various lenses, including environmental, scientific, political, economic, and ethical. Climate change threatens the basic elements of life for people around the world: access to water, food production, health, and use of land and the environment, according to Margaret Rosso Grossman, a consumer economics professor at the University of Illinois. The transformation of the Earth's climate, also known as global warming, is mainly caused by the excessive emission of greenhouse gases, also known as GHGs, which tend to stay in the atmosphere for prolonged periods of time. In 2015, the United Nations, an intergovernmental organization tasked to maintain peace and organization between countries, met at the 21st Conference of the Parties in Paris, which aimed to talk about a potential low-carbon future. Coming up in 2019, the UN will meet at the Climate Summit to focus on key sectors where action against climate change will make the most difference. Even though these summits are crucial to researching and minimizing the effects of climate change, America withdrew from the Paris Agreement. Due to America's absence from important climate change agreements, the question I based my research around was, should America join the United Nations in their efforts to minimize climate change? Climate change continues to worsen and the negative effects continue to grow. Due to the GHGs continuing to grow in the atmosphere, it is an issue that must be addressed immediately by all countries over the world. This proves that America should join the efforts to minimize climate change because its effects are too drastic to be ignored. If you look at climate change through the environmental angle, then you would see all of the negative effects that it has on the environment and its species. According to Ecological Applications, a journal that publishes papers and research discussing environmental issues, Arctic habitat is being destroyed, causing extensive redistribution of species, the disappearance of non-mobile species throughout portions of their range, and possible species extinction. Global warming is causing the Arctic to see a drastic increase in ice glacier melting. Due to these ice glaciers melting, many Arctic animals are finding themselves homeless and starving. Owen T. Lewis, a zoology professor at Oxford University, elaborates on Ecological Applications' claim of species extinction by saying that climate change, even in the absence of all of the threats, dooms 15 to 37% of species to extinction by 2050. The United Nations recently held the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016, where they talked about limiting GHG emissions, which would decrease the amount of ice glacier melting and species extinction. This picture shows how the lack of habitat from glacier melting is causing species like this polar bear to have a lack of food available. An example of a UN environmental plan working is the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol was a plan put into place to stop the use of CFCs, also known as chlorofluorocarbons, after scientists discovered they were causing a hole in the ozone layer. Sean Davis, a scientist with a PhD in atmospheric and oceanic sciences, says that the Montreal Protocol stopped ozone depletion and delayed climate change for an estimated 10 years. This agreement was ratified by all UN members and was only successful because all countries agreed to work together to stop the use of CFCs. Margaret Thatcher, a past English Prime Minister and climate change advocate, adds to this idea by saying, "We carry common burdens, face common problems, and must respond with common action." Thatcher is saying that climate change is an issue that affects everyone all over the world, and any hopes to stop it only works with everyone's cooperation. American politician and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders elaborates on Thatcher's claim by saying, "We cannot do it alone, but we can bring all countries over the world together in the fight to transform our energy system and save this planet." Like the Montreal Protocol with the CFC crisis, America must work with the UN to limit GHG emissions. Many businesses rely on cheap water and natural resources in order to succeed. According to the Stockholm Environmental Institute, a research organization that specializes in environmental issues, climate change is creating risk patterns for water scarcity, which is an important business risk for an increasingly broad range of companies. The loss of natural resources that results from climate change will put a strain on economies all over the world. Besides the business aspect of this, the cost of all the land lost will be detrimental. When elaborating on excessive flooding, Richard S.J. Toll says that the value of a loss of 1 square kilometer of dryland was $4 million. Wetland losses are about $2 million per square kilometer. The excessive amounts of ice melting and causing an increase in ocean depth caused many cities to eventually flood, resulting in devastating economic losses. The people in these areas will then have to migrate elsewhere, causing a strain on the economies of where they have migrated to, according to Mark R. Montgomery, an economics professor at Stony Brook University. There are many ethical reasons to want to mitigate climate change, especially due to its effects on poor countries. Robert Mendelsohn, a professor at Yale University, states that climate change damages are greatest for the poorest quartile of countries and that they decline with income. For example, climate change causes insufficient food production due to the irregular weather patterns like droughts. Many families in poor countries directly rely on their food production in order to survive. Due to some countries lacking financial stability and being unable to recover after the impacts of climate change, they will leave millions of people hungry and homeless. The richer and more developed countries, like America, are the ones emitting the most GHGs and causing climate change. Cynthia D. Molobita, an ethics professor at Seattle University, agrees with Mendelssohn's claim. She states that the people most vulnerable to the ravages of climate change are generally not those most responsible for it. The UN contains the world's richest countries, which makes aiding poor countries an essential topic that the UN is currently confronting. America, a wealthy and developed country, must join in on these efforts as well. This is an example of a poor country being negatively affected by climate change. The rise in sea level results in floods like this one, which can flood crops and homes. Due to poor areas being financially unable to aid in catastrophes like this village in Haiti has no hope of being restored. Even though there is a plethora of evidence pointing to the negative effects of climate change, there are still some scholars out there that see engaging in climate change mitigations as more harmful than climate change itself. Jorn Longborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, claims that climate change will result in an increase of 1.4% of global economic output, rising to 1.5% by 2025. Longborg believes that climate change will benefit the world and any negative effects will not need to be addressed until many years later. Simon Dietz, a professor of environmental policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, supports Longborg's claim that climate change is an issue that is not in dire need of being addressed right now. Dietz adds, in short, the payoffs from our own costly mitigation efforts will accrue to children and their descendants. Contrary to Dietz and Longborg's claims, Barack Obama, 44th U.S. president known as the climate change president, mentions climate change is serious, it is urgent, and it is growing. He also disagrees with Dietz that climate change mitigation will have a negative impact on future generations. According to Obama, if we fail to meet it boldly, we risk consigning future generations to an irreversible catastrophe. One solution to climate change mitigation is proposed by Liz Gallagher, director of the Climate Briefing Service, who states that America should join the United Nations with the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement mainly focuses on the emission of greenhouse gases and how the use of these greenhouse gases should be replaced with renewable energy. The agreement's plan to use renewable energy is a plan that has to be implemented by all major emissions countries in order for it to have a lasting impact. Another solution is to attend and cooperate with the UN Climate Action Summit 2019. The summit also focuses on dealing with the effects of climate change, especially on poor communities, biodiversity, conservation, and transforming the oil and gas industry. Some limitations to the solutions also include the cost of mitigating climate change falling onto taxpayer shoulders. People with jobs in the oil and gas industry will also be unemployed if America joins the UN's plans to use renewable energy and cut down on GHG emissions. Some implications to these solutions are the number of GHGs in the atmosphere greatly diminishing. All the countries working together would help the poor communities suffering from climate change and would help put together conservation plans for the environment. It is clear the pros strongly outweigh the cons in regards to climate change. It is crucial that America joins the UN's efforts to minimize climate change.
All right, Olivia, thank you. Okay, first question. How did you handle the different perspectives in order to reach your conclusion?
Most of my perspectives talked about the effects of climate change, and the only one that didn't talk too much about the effects of climate change was the political lens. I talked about the UN's agreements, like their past agreements, and what America should learn from them. In a TED Talk I watched, Sean Davis explained the Montreal Protocol, which after scientists discovered that the use of CFCs were causing a hole in the ozone layer, America worked together with the United Nations to limit that use, and this helped tie to my solution of joining UN mitigation efforts. And because the rest of my argument was the negative effects of climate change, my solutions talked about how these effects can be stopped by joining on UN mitigation efforts. For example, Margaret Rosso Grossman talked about the high levels of GHGs in the atmosphere, which could be decreased if America were to join the Paris Climate Agreement, which I mentioned in my conclusion.
Okay, thank you. All right, what might be the real-world implication or consequence of your findings? What are the implications to this community?
Because climate change is an issue right now that's mostly being talked about because of the Paris Climate Agreement just happening in 2016 and the UN, their summit coming up in 2019. It is an issue that is talked about a lot right now, and because there's still a lot of people that don't believe that climate change is a real issue, I'm hoping that if more people were aware of what I discovered, that they would believe in it more, and they should understand that it's not just affecting the animals. Like, a lot of times people believe that climate change, it's just, on the environment, but it has a lot more to do with that. It hurts economies and especially poor communities. It has a negative effect on everyone, in the world. And I think if people knew that, they would understand that it's something that needs to be discussed because it's something that affects everyone and everything on Earth.
Okay, thank you.